By the spring of 1945, the world had already witnessed 6 years of mechanized slaughter on a scale that defied comprehension. Europe lay in ruins, its cities reduced to skeletal remains, its population scattered and traumatized. On May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years collapsed in less than 12. The guns fell silent across the European continent, but in the Pacific, another war continued to rage with an intensity that showed no sign of diminishing. If anything, it was growing more savage with each passing week. The Empire of Japan, once stretching from the frozen reaches of Manchuria to the tropical jungles of New Guinea, had been systematically dismantled by American forces advancing across the vast ocean in a brutal island-hopping campaign. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each name represented not just a battle, but a nightmare of blood and fire, where men fought for every yard of coral and volcanic rock. The closer American forces came to the Japanese home islands, the more ferocious the resistance became. At Okinawa, which American planners viewed as a dress rehearsal for the invasion of Japan itself, the fighting had been apocalyptic. 12,000 Americans died. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers perished, and the civilian casualties approached 150,000 souls, caught between two armies that had long since abandoned any pretense of restraint. The lessons of Okinawa were stark and terrifying. If this was what defending one island cost, what would defending the sacred soil of Japan itself demand? The question haunted the corridors of the Pentagon and the White House throughout the summer of 1945. Every intelligence report, every interrogation of prisoners, every intercepted communication pointed to the same conclusion. Japan would not surrender. Not easily, perhaps not at all. President Harry Truman had inherited this war along with Franklin Roosevelt's office. He had been vice president for only 82 days before Roosevelt's death thrust him into command of the most powerful military machine ever assembled. Truman was a plain-spoken man from Missouri, a former artillery officer from the First World War, and he understood the weight of command in a way that few civilians could. Now he faced a decision that would define not just his presidency, but the entire future of the 20th century. How do you end a war with an enemy that refuses to accept defeat? How do you save American lives without destroying everything you claim to be fighting for? The military planners had their answer. It was called Operation Downfall, and it represented the culmination of everything the United States had learned about amphibious warfare over 4 years of island fighting. Downfall was not a single invasion, but 2 massive operations, each larger than the D-Day landings at Normandy. The first phase, Operation Olympic, would target the southern island of Kyushu in November of 1945. This would secure airfields and staging areas for the second and final assault, Operation Coronet, scheduled for March of 1946, which would strike directly at the Kanto Plain and the approaches to Tokyo itself. The scale of what was being planned defied imagination. Olympic alone called for the commitment of 14 divisions, approximately 766,000 men, landing across 35 beaches on Kyushu. This would be supported by a naval armada of 42 aircraft carriers, 24 battleships, and over 400 destroyers. The entire invasion force would exceed 3 million men when support personnel, reserves, and follow-on forces were included. For Coronet, the numbers grew even larger. 25 divisions, over 1 million assault troops, with plans to deploy up to 4 million American servicemen to Japan by the end of 1946 if resistance continued into 1947. Every troop ship in the Pacific was being readied. Every replacement depot in California and Hawaii was filling with young men, many of them teenagers who had been too young for Europe but were now reaching draft age just in time for what would be the bloodiest campaign of the war. Veterans of the European theater, men who thought they had earned their ticket home after surviving from Normandy to the Elbe, were being redeployed to the Pacific. The army was training with a desperation born of certain knowledge. They knew what was coming. They had seen Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They understood that Japan would be infinitely worse. The casualty projections varied depending on who was doing the calculating and what assumptions they made about Japanese resistance. The most optimistic estimates, which almost no one believed, suggested 250,000 American casualties, with perhaps 60 to 70,000 dead. The more realistic assessments ranged from 400,000 to 800,000 American casualties. Some planners, looking at the fanatical resistance on Okinawa and projecting it across the entire Japanese population of 70 million people, suggested that casualties could reach into the millions. Former President Herbert Hoover, after consulting with military experts, sent Truman a memo suggesting that an invasion could cost between 500,000 and 1 million American lives. And those were just American casualties. Japanese military and civilian deaths would dwarf those numbers. Conservative estimates place Japanese military casualties at 5 to 10 million. Civilian deaths from combat, disease, and starvation could range from 10 to 20 million or higher. These were not wild speculations, they were based on what had already happened on Okinawa, where civilian casualties had been staggering, and on knowledge of Japanese preparations for homeland defense. The entire population of Japan was being mobilized. Every man, woman, and child capable of holding a weapon was being organized into militia units. Bamboo spears were being distributed to school children. Civilians were being trained to strap explosives to themselves and throw their bodies under American tanks.
In Tokyo, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, known as the Big Six, met in rooms that still bore the scars of American firebombing raids. The council consisted of Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Army Minister Korochika Anami, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, and the chiefs of the Army and Navy General Staffs. These men understood that Japan had lost the war in any conventional sense. The question was not whether Japan would be defeated, but on what terms that defeat would occur, and at what cost to the Allies. The military faction, dominated by Army Minister Anami and the Army General Staff, believed that Japan's only hope lay in inflicting such catastrophic casualties on any invasion force that the Americans would agree to a negotiated peace. They called this strategy Ketsu-Go, the decisive operation. It was not a plan for victory, but a plan for an honorable defeat, one that would preserve the imperial system and avoid the complete destruction of Japanese society. The key to Ketsu-Go was making the American cost of invasion so high that even the resource-rich United States would balk at paying it. To accomplish this, Japan was transforming itself into a fortress. The island of Kyushu, which Japanese intelligence correctly identified as the likely initial invasion target, was being fortified with an intensity that bordered on obsession. 16 divisions, numbering approximately 900,000 troops, were deployed to Kyushu by midsummer. Thousands of artillery pieces were being dug into mountainsides and camouflaged so thoroughly that American aerial reconnaissance often failed to detect them. Beach obstacles were multiplied. Mines were sown in their millions across every likely landing zone. Entire villages were evacuated and their structures converted into strongpoints. But the most terrifying aspect of Japanese defensive planning was the commitment to suicide warfare on a scale never before contemplated. The kamikaze attacks that had bloodied the American fleet at Okinawa would be magnified 100-fold. Japan had reserved approximately 10,000 aircraft for kamikaze operations against an invasion fleet. Many of these were obsolete trainers and reconnaissance planes, but it did not matter. A plane did not need to be fast or maneuverable to crash into a ship. It only needed to fly. Pilots, many of them with barely 10 hours of training, were being indoctrinated with the belief that their deaths would save the nation. Beyond the air kamikazes, Japan had developed an arsenal of suicide weapons that revealed the depth of their desperation. K-10 torpedoes were essentially manned submarines designed to crash into enemy ships. Shinyo boats were small motorboats packed with explosives, piloted by men expected to ram them into landing craft. Fukaryu divers, human mines, would wait underwater near landing beaches and detonate their explosives when American troops came ashore. The entire strategy rested on the belief that if enough Americans died quickly enough, the will to continue would break. The civilian population was being prepared for this apocalypse with a propaganda campaign that mixed nationalism, honor, and fear in equal measure. The message was unambiguous. Surrender meant annihilation. American soldiers would rape and murder. Japanese culture would be erased. The emperor, the living god who embodied the nation itself, would be destroyed. Better to die fighting than to live in dishonor. Schoolchildren practiced charging with bamboo spears. Housewives learned to make crude explosives from fertilizer. The National Volunteer Combat Force was created, a civilian militia numbering in the tens of millions, organized to resist to the last person. Yet beneath this facade of fanatical determination, cracks were forming in the Japanese leadership. Not everyone in Tokyo believed that a glorious death was preferable to survival. Foreign Minister Togo and Navy Minister Yonai understood that Japan was defeated and that continuing the war would only multiply the suffering. They sought a way to end the conflict while preserving the imperial institution, which they saw as essential to Japanese identity. The problem was that the army still held effective veto power over any peace initiative, and the army remained committed to Ketsu-Go. The emperor himself, Hirohito, remained enigmatic. Japanese tradition held that the emperor did not directly involve himself in political decisions. He reigned but did not rule, ratifying the decisions of his advisors rather than making independent choices. Yet Hirohito was no fool. He had access to accurate intelligence about Japan's strategic situation. He knew the war was lost, but breaking with tradition to impose a surrender over military objections would require a level of personal intervention that no emperor had undertaken in modern Japanese history. And so the emperor watched and waited, attending meetings where generals spoke confidently of victory through sacrifice while the cities of Japan burned. By July of 1945, American B-29 superfortresses had reduced more than 60 Japanese cities to ash. The firebombing campaign, which had begun with the apocalyptic raid on Tokyo in March that killed over 100,000 people in a single night, had evolved into a systematic program of urban destruction. Night after night, formations of silver bombers would appear in the sky, and hours later, entire cities would cease to exist. The official purpose was to destroy Japan's ability to wage war by eliminating industrial production and transportation networks. But everyone understood the deeper truth. The bombing was also meant to break the will of the Japanese people, to make the cost of continuing the war so unbearable that even the most fanatical would beg for peace. It was not working. If anything, the bombing seemed to strengthen Japanese resolve, or at least the public performance of that resolve. Survivors dug through rubble with their hands, bowed to portraits of the emperor amid the ruins, and pledged to fight on. Perhaps they truly believed in final victory. Perhaps they were simply too exhausted and traumatized to imagine an alternative. Or perhaps they understood that surrender might indeed mean annihilation, and so they chose the death they knew over the death they feared. The isolation of the Japanese home islands grew more complete as summer progressed. The Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been reduced to a handful of scattered vessels hiding in remote anchorages. The submarine blockade enforced by American forces had strangled imports of food and raw materials. Rice rations were being cut. Factory production was collapsing not from bombing alone, but from lack of materials. Soldiers defending Kyushu were being told to prepare for starvation rations. The entire Japanese economy was entering a death spiral, yet the government issued directives to fight on, to endure the unbearable, to believe in miracles. In Washington, President Truman was receiving a very different set of briefings. Every morning he was presented with intelligence summaries that detailed Japanese defensive preparations on Kyushu. Japanese cryptographers had broken Japanese military codes, and they were reading detailed reports of troop deployments, artillery positions, and defensive strategies. What they read was deeply alarming. Japanese strength on Kyushu was being revised upward almost weekly. The original intelligence estimates had suggested perhaps 6 divisions defending the island. By July, it was clear there were at least 14, possibly more. The implication was obvious. The Japanese knew where the invasion was coming, and they were preparing a reception that would make Okinawa look like a skirmish.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by Army Chief George Marshall and Fleet Admiral Ernest King, remained committed to invasion as the only certain path to victory. They pointed out that the naval blockade and bombing campaign, while devastating, had not forced surrender. Therefore, invasion was necessary.
They also argued that the Soviet Union's promised entry into the war against Japan would not change the fundamental strategic calculus. Only American boots on Japanese soil would compel surrender. The casualty estimates were terrible, yes, but war was terrible. The only relevant question was whether invasion would end the war. They believed it would. Secretary War Henry Stimson was less certain. Stimson was 77 years old in the summer of 1945, a man whose career in public service stretched back to Theodore Roosevelt's administration. He had seen war from the inside, both in the trenches of the First World War and now in the councils of the Second. He understood that an invasion of Japan would be not just a military operation, but a moral catastrophe, regardless of who won. The scale of death would be so immense that it would haunt the nation for generations. Stimson began to search for alternatives, anything that might shock Japan into surrender without the need for invasion. One alternative was already taking shape in the deserts of New Mexico. The Manhattan Project, a scientific and industrial undertaking of unprecedented scope, had been racing for 3 years to develop an atomic weapon before Germany could. By the summer of 1945, Germany was defeated, but the project continued with renewed urgency, now directed at Japan. On July 16th, in the pre-dawn darkness of the New Mexico desert, the first atomic bomb was tested at a site called Trinity. The explosion released energy equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. The flash was visible 200 miles away. A mushroom cloud rose 7 miles into the sky. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the project, recalled a line from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Truman was at Potsdam, conferring with Churchill and Stalin about the post-war order when he received word of the successful test. The message was cryptic, but clear. Baby satisfactorily born. Truman now possessed a weapon that could destroy an entire city in a single blow. The question was whether to use it. The arguments were fierce and immediate. Some advisors, including Stimson, believed the bomb offered a way to end the war without invasion, potentially saving hundreds of thousands or millions of lives. Others worried about the moral implications of using such a weapon, especially against civilian populations. Still others questioned whether Japan would surrender even after an atomic attack, given their demonstrated willingness to endure conventional bombing. There was also the question of how many bombs were available. The Manhattan Project had produced enough fissionable material for 3 weapons. One had been used at Trinity. That left 2, with more in production but not ready for weeks or months. If the 2 remaining bombs were used and Japan still did not surrender, invasion would be necessary anyway, and the bombs would have achieved nothing except adding a new horror to the catalog of war. Truman authorized the use of the atomic bombs against Japanese cities, with the military given discretion over timing and targeting. The order specified that bombs would be dropped as soon as weather permitted after August 3rd. The target list included Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. These cities had been specifically preserved from conventional bombing raids so that the effects of the atomic weapons could be properly assessed. The order also indicated that additional bombs would be dropped as they became available, suggesting that Truman envisioned a sustained atomic bombing campaign if necessary. But what if that order had never been given? What if Truman, facing the horrific uncertainties of atomic warfare, had instead chosen the more conventional path? What if he had told the Joint Chiefs to proceed with Operation Downfall, to invade Japan with the largest amphibious force ever assembled, to fight a campaign that everyone knew would be the bloodiest of the war? That was the path that nearly happened. It remained a default plan right up until early August. Understanding what that invasion would have meant requires imagining the autumn of 1945 not as a time of sudden atomic endings, but as the beginning of the last and most terrible campaign of the Second World War. Operation Olympic was scheduled to begin on November 1st, 1945. The timing was deliberate. November offered the last window before winter weather made amphibious operations too risky. It also allowed maximum time to complete preparations after the end of the European War. By October, the invasion force would be assembled in bases throughout the Western Pacific. Okinawa, conquered at such terrible cost, would serve as the primary staging area. Hundreds of transport ships and landing craft would gather in Okinawan harbors. The men would be briefed, equipment loaded, final letters written. The invasion plan divided Kyushu into sectors, each assigned to a different corps. The Sixth Army, commanded by General Walter Kruger, would lead the assault. 3 corps, totaling 11 divisions in the initial wave, would hit beaches on the southern and eastern coast of Kyushu simultaneously. The First Corps would land near Miyazaki on the east coast. The 11th Corps would strike beaches near Ariake Bay. The 5th Amphibious Corps, composed of Marines, would assault the southern tip of the island near Kushikino. Once beachheads were secured, follow-on forces would pour ashore, pushing inland to capture airfields at Miyazaki, Kagoshima, and other key points. American planners assumed that Japanese resistance would be fierce, but that superior American firepower would prevail. Naval gunfire from dozens of battleships and cruisers would pulverize defensive positions. Carrier aircraft would provide close air support, bombing and strafing anything that moved. B-29s would continue their strategic bombing campaign, now targeting communications and transportation networks throughout Kyushu, to isolate Japanese defenders. Army Air Force fighters flying from bases on Okinawa and from escort carriers would contest Japanese air attacks and provide cover for the landing forces. What American planners could not fully anticipate was the degree to which Japanese defenders had prepared for exactly this scenario. By autumn of 1945, Kyushu had been transformed into a killing ground. Every beach on the southern coast was pre-registered by artillery hidden in the mountains. Interlocking fields of fire covered every approach. Underground bunkers, some carved deep into solid rock, sheltered troops and supplies from even the heaviest bombardment. The Japanese had studied American tactics for 4 years. They knew the invasion would begin with days of naval and air bombardment. They planned to survive that bombardment by going deep underground, then emerging to contest the beaches when American troops actually landed. The kamikaze threat was even more severe than American intelligence understood. Japan had dispersed its kamikaze aircraft to hundreds of small airfields, and even to stretches of highway that could serve as improvised runways. Many of these planes were hidden in caves, camouflage shelters, or even disguised as farm buildings. American air supremacy was overwhelming, but finding and destroying thousands of hidden aircraft before they could launch was impossible. The plan was simple. Wait until the invasion fleet appeared off Kyushu, then launch every available aircraft in mass attacks designed to saturate American defenses.
American carriers had demonstrated their ability to destroy dozens of attacking kamikazes at Okinawa. But at Okinawa, the kamikaze attacks had come in waves over weeks. For the Olympic invasion, Japanese plans called for throwing thousands of aircraft at the invasion fleet in the first days, perhaps the first hours. Even with radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, even with clouds of fighter cover, simple arithmetic suggested that dozens, if not hundreds, of kamikazes would get through. Each successful hit could sink a transport ship packed with troops, or cripple a carrier, or destroy a capital ship. The invasion fleet would sail into the largest suicide attack in history. American naval commanders understood this risk. They planned to position the fleet's carriers far enough offshore to give defending fighters time to intercept attackers. Destroyers and smaller vessels would form radar picket lines, sacrificing themselves if necessary to provide early warning. Every ship would sail with its anti-aircraft guns fully manned, ammunition stockpiled, damage control parties at their stations. The plan was to accept losses as the price of getting the troops ashore. Once the army was on the beaches and pushing inland, the kamikazes would have no more targets. The question was whether the fleet could survive long enough for that to happen. The initial landings would only be the beginning. Assuming the invasion force successfully established beachheads, the campaign to conquer Kyushu would likely take months. Japanese commanders had no intention of fighting a mobile defense. Instead, they planned to force American troops to dig Japanese defenders out of fortified positions one by one. Every ridgeline would require an assault. Every town would become a fortress. The terrain of Kyushu favored the defenders, with narrow valleys, dense forests, and mountains that limited the effectiveness of American armor and air power. American doctrine emphasized firepower over manpower. Rather than send infantry forward into suicidal frontal assaults, American commanders would call in artillery, naval gunfire, and airstrikes but pulverize suspected Japanese positions. Only after hours or days of bombardment would infantry advance to occupy the ruins. This approach saved American lives, but it also created vast quantities of civilian casualties. In a densely populated island like Kyushu, where every village contained military positions, the line between combatant and civilian dissolved. Houses sheltered soldiers, schools became ammunition dumps, temples served as observation posts.
When American artillery reduced a village to rubble, hundreds of civilians died alongside the soldiers. The Japanese civilian population faced an impossible situation. Government propaganda insisted that surrender meant death at the hands of barbaric Americans. American loudspeakers promised safety to those who gave up. The reality would likely fall somewhere in between. Some civilians would resist alongside soldiers, either voluntarily or under compulsion. Others would attempt to flee, but find themselves trapped between advancing American forces and retreating Japanese troops. Still others would be killed simply for being in the wrong place when the firepower fell. The experience of Okinawa suggested that civilian casualties in a Kyushu campaign could reach into the millions. Starvation would multiply the death toll. Japan's agricultural system was already collapsing under the pressure of the naval blockade and the disruption of transportation networks. Rice production had fallen dramatically as fertilizer imports ceased and farm labor was conscripted into the military. In a normal year, Kyushu produced enough food to feed its population. But 1945 was not a normal year, and an invasion would shatter what remained of civil order. Fields would become battlefields. Stored food would be consumed by hungry troops on both sides or destroyed in the fighting. Distribution networks would collapse. By the winter of 1945, starvation would begin to spread across Kyushu, killing civilians in numbers that might equal or exceed combat deaths. Disease would follow starvation. Sanitation systems, barely functional after months of bombing, would completely break down under the stress of military operations. Refugees fleeing combat zones would cluster in overcrowded camps where cholera, typhus, and dysentery would spread unchecked. American military doctors would struggle to treat their own casualties and would have limited resources for Japanese civilians. The experience of Manila, where the battle to recapture the city from Japanese forces in early 1945 killed over 100,000 Filipino civilians, offered a grim preview of what would happen when modern warfare engulfed urban areas. Kyushu cities would suffer similar or worse fates. By winter, assuming American forces had secured southern Kyushu and the crucial airfields, attention would turn to Operation Coronet, the invasion of the Kanto Plain and the march on Tokyo. Coronet was even larger than Olympic, envisioning the deployment of 25 divisions, over 1 million assault troops, landing on beaches near Tokyo Bay in March of 1946. The plan called for simultaneous landings at Sagami Bay and Kashima, followed by a converging assault on Tokyo from 2 directions. The 8th Army, redeployed from Europe, would lead Coronet alongside the 1st Army. Airborne divisions would seize key bridges and road junctions. It would be the culmination of everything America had learned about combined arms warfare, the absolute maximum application of firepower and manpower that the nation could sustain. But Coronet assumed that Olympic had succeeded in securing Kyushu within a few months. What if the fighting on Kyushu dragged into winter and spring? What if Japanese resistance proved even more determined than feared? What if the Kamikaze attacks inflicted crippling losses on American shipping, making it impossible to sustain the forces ashore? These were not idle worries. Intelligence reports from Kyushu showed Japanese defensive preparations intensifying throughout the summer. The longer America waited to invade, the stronger Japan's defenses became. But rushing the invasion risked inadequate preparation and even higher casualties. There was also the question of whether American public support for the war would survive the casualty lists from an invasion. By the summer of 1945, Americans were exhausted. The war had lasted nearly 4 years. Almost every family had someone in uniform. Gold stars hung in windows across the nation, marking homes where a son or husband would never return. The victory in Europe had created expectations that the war would soon end everywhere. Now, instead of demobilization, the nation was being asked to gear up for an even larger campaign, one that would produce casualties on a scale that would make previous battles look modest. Truman understood the political dimensions of this decision. He was not an elected president, but a successor who had inherited the office. Congressional elections were scheduled for 1946, and the Republican Party was already attacking his administration as insufficiently vigorous in prosecuting the war. If he delayed the invasion and the war dragged into 1947, he would be accused of weakness. If he ordered the invasion and casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands, he would be blamed for every death. There was no politically safe choice, only varying degrees of risk. Meanwhile, in Japan, the political situation was approaching its own crisis. The Big Six remained deadlocked. The military faction insisted on continuing the war, pointing to the defensive preparations on Kyushu as evidence that Japan could inflict unacceptable casualties on any invasion. The peace faction, led by Foreign Minister Togo, argued that continuation was suicide and that Japan should seek terms while it still had some leverage. The emperor listened to both sides and said little, bound by tradition and by his own uncertainty about which path served Japan better. Behind the scenes, Japanese diplomats were attempting to open channels to the Soviet Union, hoping that Stalin might mediate a negotiated peace. This strategy was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet intentions. Stalin had promised Roosevelt at Yalta that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. That deadline fell in early August. Soviet forces were already massing in Manchuria, preparing for a massive offensive against the Japanese army stationed there. Stalin had no interest in mediating peace. He wanted territory and influence in post-war Asia, and the way to get that was to join the war, conquer as much Japanese-held territory as possible, and then claim a seat at the table when terms were dictated. The Soviet declaration of war on Japan, which occurred on August 9th in actual history, would have happened regardless of whether atomic bombs were used. The timing was driven by Stalin's promises to the Allies and by the completion of Soviet military preparations. If Operation Downfall had proceeded instead of the atomic bombings, Soviet entry would have occurred right as American forces were launching Olympic or in the final preparatory stages. This would have created a bizarre situation where Japan faced simultaneous invasions from the south by American forces and from the north and west by Soviet armies.
The Soviet invasion of Manchuria was a blitzkrieg of extraordinary violence and speed. Over 1 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed through Japanese defenses in a matter of days. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japanese militarism, was destroyed as an effective fighting force within a week. Soviet forces raced south through Korea, seized islands north of Japan, and made clear their intention to occupy as much territory as possible before any ceasefire. If the war had continued into the autumn and winter, Soviet forces might have attempted landings on Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, opening a second front that would have forced Japan to divide its already overstretched forces. From the American perspective, Soviet entry into the Pacific War was both welcome and worrying. Welcome because it tied down Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea that might otherwise have been redeployed to defend the home islands. Worrying because it meant the Soviets would demand a say in post-war Japan, potentially leading to a divided occupation similar to what was happening in Germany. Truman and his advisors had no desire to see Japan split into American and Soviet zones, with all the instability and tension that would create. This added urgency to the desire to force Japanese surrender quickly, before Soviet influence could expand too far. As autumn approached in this alternate timeline, the final preparations for Olympic would be reaching completion. Across the Pacific, men were boarding ships, checking equipment, writing last letters home. Many of them understood, with the clarity that comes from experience, that they were about to participate in something unprecedented. The veterans of Iwo Jima and Okinawa knew what to expect. They knew the Japanese would fight to the death. They knew that American firepower would pulverize the landscape. They knew that thousands of them would die on beaches or in the mountains of Kyushu, and there was nothing anyone could do to prevent it except cancel the invasion. But that was not a decision they could make. They were soldiers. Their job was to follow orders, to get in the boats, to hit the beaches, to fight their way forward 1 yard at a time until either they reached their objective or they fell. The moral weight of this decision rested on Truman and the Joint Chiefs, and to a lesser extent on the American people who through their elected representatives had demanded unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender meant exactly that. No negotiation, no compromise, no face-saving gestures. Japan must accept total defeat and submit to whatever terms the Allies dictated. This policy, announced by Roosevelt at Casablanca in 1943, had been motivated by the desire to avoid the mistakes of the First World War, where an ambiguous armistice had allowed Germany to later claim it had been stabbed in the back rather than defeated. This time there would be no ambiguity. Defeat would be complete and undeniable. But unconditional surrender also removed any incentive for Japan to capitulate before absolute military collapse. If surrender meant the same terms regardless of timing, why not fight on? The Japanese military leadership understood that they could not win the war in any meaningful sense. But they could make victory so costly for the Allies that the terms might be moderated. If invasion resulted in 500,000 American casualties, might Truman agree to preserve the emperor and allow some degree of Japanese self-governance? This was the gamble behind Ketsu-Go. Not victory, but a costly enough defeat that Japan might negotiate better terms. American intelligence was aware of this Japanese strategy. Intercepted communications revealed that Japanese leaders were discussing exactly how many casualties would be required to force negotiations. Some Japanese estimates suggested that if they could kill or wound 300,000 Americans, the United States would seek terms. Whether this was realistic was unknowable, but it revealed the calculus of desperation that governed Japanese thinking. They knew they would lose. The question was how much of Japan would remain after that loss. For the ordinary Japanese soldier waiting in a bunker on Kyushu, these grand strategic questions were irrelevant. He knew that American forces were coming. He knew he was expected to die stopping them. His training had emphasized spiritual strength over material advantage. He had been told that one Japanese soldier fighting on sacred soil was worth 10 Americans. He had been given a rifle, perhaps, or a machine gun, and told to hold his position to the death. Some soldiers believed this propaganda. Others were simply too exhausted, too hungry, too numbed by years of war to care. They would fight because fighting was what they had been doing for years, because there was nothing else to do, because desertion meant execution, and because some small part of them hoped that their sacrifice might mean something. The civilian militia, the National Volunteer Combat Force, was in even worse shape. These were not soldiers, but farmers, shopkeepers, school teachers, children. They had been given minimal training, obsolete or improvised weapons, and instructions to resist the invaders at all costs. American intelligence estimates suggested that the militia numbered over 25 million people nationwide, with perhaps 5 million on Kyushu alone. But numbers were meaningless without training, equipment, and leadership. A civilian with a bamboo spear was not a meaningful threat to an American tank. Yet, in the context of an invasion, these millions of barely armed civilians would be in the combat zone, and distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants would become impossible. The laws of war, already strained to breaking by 4 years of total war, would collapse entirely. American soldiers, confronted with civilians who might be armed or might be carrying explosives or might simply be fleeing in terror, would make split-second decisions that would haunt them forever. Fire or don't fire. Save your own life or risk giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Multiply those decisions by hundreds of thousands of soldiers over months of combat, and the result would be a moral catastrophe of staggering dimensions. Neither side wanted this. Both sides were preparing for it. By late October, if the invasion were proceeding, the weather over the Pacific would begin to shift. Autumn typhoons would churn through the area, forcing delays in naval operations and making air support unreliable. The invasion fleet would sail through heavy seas, with thousands of soldiers packed below decks, seasick and terrified. The pre-invasion bombardment would begin days before the actual landings, with battleships moving close to shore to pound defensive positions with their massive guns. Carrier aircraft would sweep over Kyushu, bombing and strafing. B-29s would drop their loads on communication centers and troop concentrations. The Japanese response would begin as soon as the fleet appeared. Kamikaze pilots would take off from their hidden airfields, flying low to avoid radar, aiming for the carriers and transports. American fighters would scramble to intercept, and the sky over Kyushu would become a maelstrom of fire and metal. Some kamikazes would be shot down miles from their targets, others would weave through the defensive fire, guided by the terrifying focus that comes from accepting death, and plunge into ships. The explosions would be visible from dozens of miles away. Columns of black smoke would mark each hit. The toll would mount with each passing hour. Even if the kamikazes failed to stop the invasion, they would succeed in their deeper purpose, which was to spread terror and demonstrate Japanese willingness to die. Every pilot who succeeded in crashing his plane into a ship proved that Japan would not surrender easily. Every casualty inflicted raised the price of victory. This was psychological warfare of the most brutal kind, and it would work not because it would stop the invasion, but because it would make every American death feel like a waste.
On the morning of the landings, November 1st in this imagined timeline, the assault waves would form up in the darkness before dawn. Landing craft would be loaded with troops, their faces painted with camouflage, their weapons checked one final time. Officers would give brief speeches, trying to sound confident, trying to project leadership, knowing that words were meaningless now. The only thing that mattered was getting to the beach, getting off the beach, and surviving long enough to reach the first objective. The landing craft would begin their run to shore, diesel engines roaring, waves slapping against steel hulls. Men would crouch in the well decks, unable to see anything, only able to hear the sound of naval gunfire overhead and the occasional explosion when a kamikaze found its target. The naval bombardment would lift as the first wave approached the beaches. This was the most dangerous moment, the gap between when supporting fire ceased and when troops actually landed. In that gap, Japanese defenders would emerge from their shelters and man their weapons. Artillery that had survived days of bombardment would open fire, dropping shells onto the beaches and into the surf. Machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire would begin to chatter. Mortars would lob bombs in high arcs, designed to burst above ground and spray shrapnel across wide areas. The water would erupt in geysers. Landing craft would take direct hits and explode, killing everyone aboard instantly. Others would reach the beach, drop their ramps, and disgorge troops into a storm of fire. The first men off the boats would have the highest casualty rates. This was always true in amphibious assaults. The first wave absorbed the worst of the defensive fire, while follow-on waves benefited from the confusion and suppression that the initial assault created. On the beaches of Kyushu, that first wave would face something beyond the experience of even the Iwo Jima and Okinawa veterans. The density of defensive fire, the number of hidden positions, the willingness of Japanese soldiers to hold their fire until the Americans were point-blank range, all of it would combine to create casualties at a rate that would shock even hardened commanders. Some landing zones would be worse than others. On beaches where Japanese defensive preparations were most elaborate, entire companies might be destroyed before they advanced 100 yards. On other beaches where bombardment had been more effective or Japanese defenses less developed, troops would manage to push inland relatively quickly. But nowhere would the landing be easy. Nowhere would resistance be light. Every foot of ground would cost blood, and the blood would turn the surf red as waves washed over bodies that would never be recovered. Behind the assault waves, medics would work frantically to save lives. Corpsmen would wade through fire to reach wounded men, dragging them to cover, applying tourniquets, injecting morphine. Aid stations set up just off the beaches would become scenes of controlled chaos as the wounded flooded in faster than doctors could treat them. Triage decisions would be made in seconds. This man might survive with immediate surgery. That man was too far gone. This one could wait. That one needed evacuation to a hospital ship. The cries of the wounded would blend with the sound of ongoing combat into a cacophony that would define the memory of everyone who experienced it. By nightfall of the first day, if the landings followed the pattern of previous invasions, American forces would have established shallow beachheads perhaps a mile or two deep. The cost would have been staggering. Casualties might reach 10,000 or more on the first day alone, with perhaps 2,000 killed. These numbers would shock the American public when they were eventually recorded, though the military would delay releasing full casualty figures for fear of damaging morale. But there would be no hiding the scale of the disaster. Hospital ships filling with wounded, transport ships returning empty, the absence of victory communiques, all would signal that something had gone terribly wrong. Yet, from the military perspective, the landings would be judged a success if beachheads were established and troops continued to flow ashore. The plan had always anticipated high initial casualties. The question was whether American forces could sustain the momentum, pushing inland before Japanese reserves could counterattack and drive them back into the sea. This was the critical phase of any amphibious operation, the hours and days immediately after landing, when the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Japanese commanders would not wait passively for American forces to consolidate. As soon as it became clear where the main landings had occurred, reserve units would move forward to launch counterattacks. These would not be carefully planned operations, but desperate attempts to hit American forces while they were still disorganized and vulnerable. Japanese infantry would attack at night, using the darkness to negate American air and artillery advantages. They would infiltrate American lines, seeking to create confusion and panic. Suicide squads carrying satchel charges would target American tanks and artillery positions. The fighting would be intimate and vicious, often hand-to-hand, with no quarter asked or given. American forces had learned to expect Japanese night attacks and had developed tactics to counter them. Perimeters would be tightly held, with interlocking fields of fire. Illumination rounds from mortars and artillery would turn night into artificial day. Pre-registered artillery fire would hammer suspected Japanese assembly areas. Still, some Japanese attackers would get through, and when they did, the results would be horrific. A single determined soldier with explosives could destroy a tank or kill a dozen men in a command post. The psychological effect of these attacks was as important as the physical damage. They kept American troops on edge, exhausted from constant vigilance, unable to rest even when not actively fighting. As November progressed in this alternate timeline, the battle for Kyushu would settle into a grim pattern. American forces would advance slowly, measuring progress in hundreds of yards per day rather than miles. Each advance would require massive firepower preparation. Artillery would pound suspected Japanese positions for hours. Naval guns would add their weight. Close air support would hit targets marked by forward observers. Only then would infantry move forward, and even then they would encounter resistance. Japanese defenders would have fallen back to secondary positions, often more fortified than the ones just destroyed. The process would repeat, day after day, week after week. The terrain worked against the attackers. Kyushu was mountainous and heavily forested in many areas, limiting the mobility advantages that American armor and mechanization normally provided. Roads were easily blocked by demolitions. Bridges were destroyed. Valleys became killing zones where a handful of defenders in the surrounding hills could pin down battalions. Caves honeycombing the mountains provided shelter from even the heaviest bombardment and had to be reduced one by one, often with flamethrowers and explosives at close range. This kind of fighting was exhausting and psychologically destructive. Men who survived weeks of it became hollow-eyed and numb, moving forward because orders demanded it, no longer capable of processing the death around them. Civilian casualties would mount alongside military losses. Kyushu's population of approximately 10 million included everyone from infants to elderly, and they were all in the combat zone. Some would flee ahead of advancing American forces, creating massive refugee columns that clogged roads and complicated military movements. Others would shelter in place, hiding in basements or caves, hoping to survive until the fighting passed. Some others would be mobilized by Japanese authorities to construct fortifications, transport supplies, or even fight alongside soldiers. The line between civilian and combatant would blur to the point of meaningless. American rules of engagement would struggle to keep pace with reality. Official policy prohibited targeting civilians, but how did you distinguish civilians from militia? How did you respond when fire came from a house where women and children might be sheltering? How did you handle a village where some inhabitants wanted to surrender while Japanese soldiers forced others to resist? Commanders on the ground would make pragmatic decisions that prioritize protecting their own troops, and those decisions would often mean treating any Japanese person in a combat zone as a potential threat. The moral cost of this approach would become clear only later, when historians tallied the dead and found that civilian casualties outnumbered military by significant margins.
The media coverage of the Kyushu campaign would be unlike anything America had seen before. Correspondents who had covered the European War and earlier Pacific battles would report from Kyushu with a sense of growing horror. The scale of destruction, the intensity of combat, the casualty figures, all would be reported in dispatches that would shock readers back home. Photographs of wounded soldiers, of destroyed cities, of refugees fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs would fill newspapers and newsreels. For the first time, many Americans would begin to question whether unconditional surrender was worth this price. Political opposition to the war would begin to crystallize by late November or early December. Isolationist Republicans who had been silenced by Pearl Harbor would find their voice again, arguing that the war should have been ended through negotiation rather than invasion. Mothers of servicemen would demand to know why their sons were dying for islands on the other side of the world. Veterans groups would split between those who supported seeing the war through to complete victory and those who had seen enough death. Truman would face pressure from all sides. End the war quickly, end the war on favorable terms, end the war without abandoning the soldiers already fighting. These demands were mutually incompatible, and Truman would have no good options. In Japan, the political situation would also approach crisis. The military faction would point to American casualties as evidence that Ketsu-Go was working. If the Americans had already lost tens of thousands in just the first month of fighting, surely they would negotiate rather than continue. But the peace faction would argue that continuing the war meant the complete destruction of Japan. Cities were still being bombed, the population was starving, Soviet forces had overrun Manchuria and were approaching the home islands. Prolonging the war would only multiply the suffering without changing the outcome. The emperor would be caught between these factions, and tradition provided no guidance for the choice he faced. By December, if the fighting continued, winter weather would add another layer of misery to the campaign. Rain and cold would turn battlefields into quagmires. Soldiers on both sides would suffer from exposure, trench foot, and diseases that flourished in unsanitary conditions. Supply lines would strain under the demand for ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies. Replacement troops would arrive from the United States, green and terrified, thrust into combat with minimal acclimatization. The veteran divisions that had spearheaded the invasion would be shadows of their former strength, their ranks filled with replacements who lacked the cohesion and experience that made units effective. Japanese forces would be in even worse condition. Cut off from supply by American control of the seas and air, they would be reduced to subsistence rations, ammunition would be strictly rationed, medical supplies would be non-exempt, wounded soldiers would die from infections that simple antibiotics could have prevented. Yet even in this desperate state, many Japanese units would continue to resist. Some because they still believed in victory, others because they feared what would happen if they surrendered. Still others simply because they knew no other way to live. The army had been their entire world for years, and without it, they had no identity. As the campaign dragged into winter, American casualties would continue to mount. By January of 1946, if the fighting followed the most optimistic projections, American losses on Kyushu might reach 100,000, with perhaps 25,000 dead. Japanese military casualties would be several times higher, perhaps 500,000 killed and wounded. And civilian casualties would be climbing toward 1 million, most from starvation, disease, and being caught in combat zones. These numbers would exceed the worst predictions made before the invasion, yet Kyushu would still not be secured. Japanese forces would have retreated into the mountains of central Kyushu, where they could continue to resist for months. At this point, American planners would face a terrible choice: continue the grinding campaign to pacify all of Kyushu, which might take until spring, or declare the southern part of the island secured and begin preparations for Operation Coronet, the invasion of Honshu and the drive on Tokyo. The logic favored moving forward. The airfields in southern Kyushu were now operational, giving American Air Force's bases closer to Tokyo. The longer America waited, the more time Japan had to strengthen defenses around Tokyo. But the political and human cost of launching Coronet while Kyushu was still contested was almost unthinkable. Truman would face the same decision again, only worse. Operation Coronet would be even larger than Olympic, involving more troops, more ships, more casualties. Intelligence reports would indicate that Japanese defenses around Tokyo were even more formidable than those on Kyushu had been. The entire population of the Kanto Plain, over 20 million people, was being mobilized for defense. Every building in Tokyo was being prepared for urban combat. Japanese military planners were openly stating that Tokyo would be defended to the last man, woman, and child. American estimates suggested that taking Tokyo could cost 200,000 to 500,000 American casualties, with Japanese losses in the millions. Could America sustain such losses? Could any democracy ask its citizens to accept such a butcher's bill? These questions would dominate Washington in the winter of 1946. The Joint Chiefs would insist that victory required defeating Japan completely, which meant taking Tokyo. Anything less would leave the war unresolved and risk Japan rebuilding for another conflict in a generation. But members of Congress facing re-election in November 1946 would begin to openly question whether unconditional surrender was the right policy. Perhaps it was time to negotiate. Perhaps preserving the emperor and allowing a degree of Japanese self-governance was acceptable if it ended the war. The problem with negotiation was that it required Japan to agree to terms, and there was little evidence that Japanese leadership was prepared to surrender on any terms that America could accept. The military faction in Tokyo would interpret any American willingness to negotiate as weakness, as proof that Ketsu-Go was succeeding. They would demand better terms, perhaps preservation not just of the emperor but of the military government, perhaps retention of some conquered territories. America could not accept those terms without betraying everything the war had been fought for. So the war would continue, not because either side wanted it, but because neither side could find a way to end it.
The Soviet Union's role would complicate matters further. By early 1946, Soviet forces would have occupied all of Manchuria, Korea, and possibly parts of Hokkaido. Stalin would be demanding a role in the occupation of Japan proper, and he would have the military presence to back up that demand. Truman would be faced with the prospect of a divided Japan, with all the instability that implied. This would add urgency to ending the war quickly, but it would also limit American options. Negotiating with Japan might give the Soviets time to expand their occupation zone, but continuing the invasion would cost American lives while Stalin gained territory essentially for free. The civilians of Japan would bear the worst of this prolonged agony. By winter of 1946, starvation would be widespread. The combination of naval blockade, disruption of transportation networks, and the diversion of resources to military use would create famine conditions across much of Japan. Children would die by the thousands. The elderly would simply lie down and wait for death. Urban populations, unable to grow food and cut off from rural supplies, would suffer most severely. The government would maintain rations for soldiers and war workers, but everyone else would be left to forage, barter, and steal to survive. Disease would flourish in these conditions. Tuberculosis, always endemic in Japan, would spread unchecked. Vitamin deficiency diseases would appear. Typhus and cholera would break out in refugee camps and bombed-out cities. Japan's medical system, never adequate to begin with, would completely collapse under the strain. Hospitals would lack medicines, bandages, even basic sanitation. Doctors would have to choose which patients to treat and which to abandon. The scenes would be medieval in their horror, and they would be happening in a nation that had been an industrial power less than a year earlier. In this context, the use of atomic weapons might have seemed like a merciful alternative. If two bombs could shock Japan into surrender and avoid all this suffering, perhaps their use would have been justified even after invasion had begun. But by winter of 1946, the political and psychological situation would be different from what it had been in August of 1945. American forces would already be dying in large numbers on Japanese soil. The sunk cost fallacy would argue for continuing the invasion rather than switching strategies. And there would be questions about whether atomic bombs dropped on Japanese cities would even lead to surrender, given that conventional bombing and invasion had not. The alternative history becomes murkier at this point because so many variables come into play. Would the emperor finally intervene to impose surrender, breaking with all tradition? Would the military faction stage a coup to prevent surrender, plunging Japan into civil war even as American forces advanced? Would the American public's will to continue collapse, forcing Truman to seek negotiated terms? Would the Soviet Union launch its own invasion of Honshu, racing American forces to Tokyo? Any of these scenarios could have occurred, and each would have led to radically different outcomes. What seems most likely, given the historical record and the logic of the situation, is that Operation Coronet would have been launched in March or April of 1946, despite all the costs and doubts. The invasion would have gone forward because no one could find an alternative that was politically and strategically acceptable. American forces would have landed on the beaches near Tokyo, facing the same fanatical resistance they had encountered on Kyushu, but magnified by the sacred significance of defending the capital. The battle for Tokyo would have made the Battle of Berlin look like a minor skirmish. Urban combat, with its close quarters and lack of clear front lines, would create conditions where American firepower advantages were minimized and Japanese advantages in knowledge of terrain were maximized. The fighting in Tokyo could have lasted months. Every city block would have to be cleared. Every building would be a potential strongpoint. Subway tunnels would become battlegrounds. The Imperial Palace would be surrounded by multiple defensive rings, and Japanese soldiers would fight to the death rather than allow the emperor to fall into American hands. Civilian casualties in Tokyo alone could have reached into the millions, as the city was transformed into a charnel house. The experience would have traumatized everyone involved, American soldiers and Japanese civilians alike, and would have cast a shadow over the post-war world that might have been even darker than the shadow cast by the atomic bombs. At some point in this nightmare, probably by summer of 1946, the emperor would have been forced to act. Either Japan would surrender, accepting total defeat and the end of the imperial system, or it would continue fighting until literally nothing remained. The choice was between national annihilation now, or perhaps slightly later. When framed that way, surrender became not just acceptable, but necessary. The emperor would have called a meeting of the Big Six, perhaps in a bunker deep beneath the ruined capital, and would have announced his decision to end the war. The military faction would have had to accept this decision or stage a coup, and by this point, they would likely have lacked the resources and support to successfully overthrow the government. The surrender, when it finally came, would have been unconditional in name, but negotiated in practice. America would have agreed to preserve the emperor as a figurehead, recognizing that his authority was necessary to ensure compliance with surrender terms. Japanese forces throughout Asia and the Pacific would have been ordered to lay down their arms, and most would have complied, though some units would have fought on as guerrillas for months or years. The occupation would have begun, but it would have been occurring in a Japan so devastated, so traumatized, so physically and psychologically destroyed that reconstruction would have been even more challenging than it was in actual history. The casualty toll of this alternate timeline defies easy calculation, but estimates can be made. American military casualties for the full invasion of Japan might have reached 400,000 to 800,000, with deaths possibly exceeding 150,000. Japanese military casualties would be several million killed and wounded. Japanese civilian casualties could have ranged from 5 million to 15 million or even higher, most from starvation, disease, and being caught in combat zones. The total death toll for the invasion of Japan could have exceeded 20 million people, making it one of the bloodiest campaigns in human history, comparable to the Eastern Front of the European War. The political consequences would be profound. The United States would have emerged from the war victorious, but traumatized, a nation that had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of its young men to achieve a victory that felt hollow. The glorification of military service that characterized post-war America in actual history would have been tempered by a much darker understanding of war's cost. Veterans of the Japan campaign would have returned home with psychological wounds that 1940s medicine had no way to treat. Many would have struggled with what we now call PTSD for the rest of their lives, and American society would have had to grapple with having created a generation of traumatized men.
Japan would have been physically destroyed to a degree difficult to imagine. Virtually every major city would have been reduced to rubble, either by conventional bombing, atomic weapons, or ground combat. The industrial base would have been completely eliminated. The transportation network would be shattered. Millions would be homeless, starving, or dead. The occupation would have had to feed the population before it could even begin to think about political reform or economic reconstruction. It would have taken decades for Japan to recover, and the Japan that emerged would have been very different from the peaceful, prosperous, democratic nation that actual history produced. The moral dimensions of this alternate history are complex. On one hand, avoiding the use of atomic weapons might seem morally preferable. Nuclear weapons introduced a new level of horror to warfare, and their use on civilian populations remains controversial to this day. On the other hand, the invasion of Japan would have caused vastly more death and suffering than the atomic bombs did. The bombs killed perhaps 200,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The invasion might have killed 100 times that number. So which choice was more moral? The one that used terrible weapons but ended the war quickly, or the one that relied on conventional means but caused far greater destruction? There is no satisfactory answer to that question. Both choices were terrible. Both would have caused immense suffering. The atomic bombs were not used because they were the moral choice, but because they offered a way to end the war without invasion. Truman made that decision knowing full well the horror it would unleash, but believing that the alternative horror was worse. History has largely vindicated that judgment, not because the atomic bombings were good, but because the alternative was so much worse. The impact on the Cold War would also have been significant. In actual history, the atomic bomb gave the United States a temporary monopoly on the most powerful weapon ever created. This monopoly influenced Soviet behavior and American policy during the crucial early years of the Cold War. In the alternate timeline, where invasion occurred instead, the atomic bomb would still have been developed, but its debut would have been delayed, or its use might have seemed less decisive. The Soviets might have been less intimidated, less convinced of American technological superiority. The arms race might have begun differently, perhaps less intensely, or perhaps more quickly, as Stalin raced to close a gap he perceived as smaller. The demonstration of American willingness to accept massive casualties to achieve victory might have sent a different message to Stalin. Instead of seeing America as a nation that relied on technological superiority to avoid sacrificing its own people, he might have seen a nation willing to pay any price for its objectives. This could have made the Soviet Union more cautious in its post-war expansion, or it could have convinced Stalin that only matching American ruthlessness would ensure Soviet security. The counterfactuals multiply, but the point remains that the invasion of Japan would have shaped the Cold War in ways we can only speculate about. For the Japanese people, the experience of invasion and occupation would have created a national trauma even deeper than what actually occurred. In actual history, Japan's defeat was sudden and shocking, but it was also relatively clean. The emperor announced surrender, and for most Japanese, the war simply ended. There was no extended period of combat on Japanese soil, no prolonged agony of watching their homeland destroyed piece by piece. In the invasion timeline, millions of Japanese would have personally experienced the war's horror, would have lost family members to combat or starvation, would have watched their cities burn. This collective trauma would have influenced Japanese culture and politics for generations. The reconstruction of Japan after such devastation would have required an even greater commitment from the United States than actually occurred. In real history, America occupied Japan and invested heavily in its reconstruction, both for humanitarian reasons and to create a stable democratic ally in Asia. In the invasion timeline, the scale of destruction would have been so much greater that reconstruction would have taken decades rather than years. The Marshall Plan for Europe was expensive enough. A similar program for Japan after invasion would have strained even America's vast resources. And the political will to fund such reconstruction after such a bloody victory might not have existed. Americans might have been more inclined to simply leave Japan to rebuild itself or to impose harsher terms that prioritized American security over Japanese recovery. The human stories from this alternate timeline would have been tales of unimaginable suffering and occasional heroism. American soldiers fighting their way through Japanese cities would have committed acts of great courage and also acts they would regret for the rest of their lives. The moral clarity of fighting fascism would have been lost in the fog of urban combat, where everyone was a potential enemy. Japanese soldiers and civilians facing extinction would have displayed both fanatical resistance and quiet dignity. Families would have stayed together until death claimed them. Individuals would have made impossible choices about whom to save and whom to sacrifice.
In the end, the invasion of Japan did not happen. Truman authorized the use of atomic weapons, and Japan surrendered after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet declaration of war convinced even the military faction that further resistance was suicide. Operation Downfall remained a plan, a nightmare contemplated but never realized. The atomic age began not with an invasion but with two mushroom clouds, and humanity crossed the threshold from which there would be no return. The age of conventional great power war ended, replaced by an age of nuclear deterrence where the next total war would mean extinction. Looking back from our present vantage point, we can see that Truman's decision, whatever its moral complexity, achieved its primary objective. It ended the work quickly with far fewer casualties than invasion would have caused. Japan surrendered, was occupied, reformed, and rebuilt into a peaceful, democratic, and economic powerhouse. The imperial system was preserved in neutered form, which helped stabilize the occupation. American casualties were limited to those already suffered in the Pacific Island campaigns. The Cold War began under American nuclear monopoly, which may have prevented Soviet expansion beyond what actually occurred. But we should not let the relative success of the atomic ending obscure the horror of what nearly happened. Operation Downfall was a real plan, carefully crafted, thoroughly prepared, and nearly executed. Millions of men would have fought and died in the most brutal campaign of the 20th century. Japan would have been physically destroyed and psychologically shattered. America would have emerged victorious but morally compromised by the scale of destruction it had inflicted. The world would have learned different lessons from the war's end, lessons about the willingness of democracies to sacrifice their own people, and about the total devastation that modern war could inflict even without nuclear weapons. The choice between atomic weapons and invasion was not a choice between good and evil, but between two forms of horror. Truman chose the horror that would end the war quickly, and history has generally judged that he chose correctly. But we should remember what the alternative looked like, what it would have meant for the millions who would have died, what it would have done to the post-war world. Operation Downfall stands as a monument to a nightmare contemplated and rejected, a path not taken that nevertheless haunts our understanding of what war means and what prices nations are willing to pay for victory. In the end, the atomic bomb was not just the end of a war, it was the end of an illusion, the illusion that humanity could ever control the fire it had unleashed.